Welcome back, my friends, to the Sweet Spot, where IT leaders share the insight with other leaders and others that want to lead. My name is Carlos Vargas, and as in every week, I have my two co-hosts, Holton and Paul Lewis. Hello, guys.
Hey there.
So it's a little bit chilly. We're almost at the end of 2021. Any plans?
It's 13 degrees outside.
13, not in my house.
What is it at your house? Are you at like -2?
We're definitely in the negatives, and we have this wind that is knocking down like 100-year-old trees. Like it's just a big, tornado alley here, and it's killing out all the vegetation.
Yeah, we shipped that to you a couple days ago.
Yeah, it's massive.
We had 100+ degree winds here in Colorado. They were knocking stuff over. RVs knocked on their sides. Somebody's like canvas garage ended up in the power lines. Yeah, It's been fascinating. Flights were canceled, right? DIA, DIA is kind of interesting because it's incredibly massive. And they're because it's so big, and I don't know about other airports really. So every airport could do this, but the runways all face different directions,
right?
So that when there's high winds, they can use the runways that are direct to the wind.
Right.
But of course, that causes massive delays and cancellations because you go from 8 runways to 2.
Right.
Right.
And then who wins?
You're welcome to the winds. I did not appreciate them. I didn't find that to be an exciting geological or geo feature.
I wonder who wins that argument. Who pays the most for gate fees? Like what's the precedence of who gets to take off and who doesn't?
Yeah, I'd love to see the inside of an airport,
right?
To that depth, right? What is the decision tree made on? There's this issue. Who gets priority for what? Right? We have fewer gate agents. We have fewer, we have fewer grounds people. Who gets priority in the grounds people? And I'd love to know. I mean, for that matter, like who pays for what? Because there's a line of demarcation.
Right.
Baggage handlers belong to the airport, like the airline. The airline hires the baggage handlers.
That's right.
But does that extend to everything? Like what about the fueling trucks
or the catering?
Yeah. Right. Is catering single or is it contracted?
Right.
Like, does United have their catering services at every airport that United's at, or just the hubs? Or is it one service that then contracts with all the airlines that ship out of there and use their, pack their gear with their things? Like, I'd find that kind of fascinating.
Yeah, the business model would be interesting to go through. The one thing I know the most, and this is based on a couple of our trips that we did, is that there's a decent amount of revenue that comes from parking, a decent amount of revenue that comes from gate fees, and a decent amount of revenue that comes from not retail transaction, but retail leasing.
Yeah, the mall.
Yeah, the mall.
Right, because they have a traditional mall model.
Right.
Right. But one of the things that I found out is the number of TSA agents at every location is set by congressional order. So
interesting.
Yes. So DIA is an international airport, and they've added a bunch of international legs, international flights, international locations, whatever. So they've massively increased their international pre-COVID.
Yeah.
Post-COVID, they don't have any, but pre-COVID, and there were a ton of issues where customs was just closed because they had narrow hours. And so I was talking to the person, one of the people responsible for that at DIA, and I'm like, that needs to be fixed. Like, I get you want to talk to international travelers, that has to be fixed. And they're like, yeah, we're aware. We're happy to fix it. We're happy to pay for it, but it requires a congressional order to hire a TSA agent.
I see. Is it absolute? In other words, you can have 12 people, or is it a calculated figure? Based on the number of flights in, you get X amount.
No. It's absolute. And if you want to make any changes to the absolute, it requires a congressional order. So you get 12 TSA agents, and these are the shifts that they will work. And if you'd like to change that, it's a congressional order.
Could be worse. You're only allowed to have John and Sally. They can only work between 9 and 3.
And if John and Sally quit, congressional order to open the rec. And for all I know, it probably is.
And you can only replace them with someone named Sally.
Named John and Sally.
So if we think about that and that information gets out, then there will be a problem because we need to figure out who in the congressional order is the one that has to approve it. And that we can now talk about what is happening about information leakage. This past week, we have had a bunch of information leakage with that log4j thing, and we were having fun.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
that was a stretch.
yeah, but yeah, log4j is the kind of big thing in our world right now. It's likely to still be a topic of conversation when this is published. And the challenge ultimately is it's another library that's used in everything, right? You may not use the code yourself in any of your custom software development efforts, but can you guarantee that the embedded OS provider for whatever your tool is doesn't use it, right? Can you guarantee it's not part of your ISV's software tooling? And I truly mean guarantee, right? Because just because they say no doesn't mean they're right. If you don't know what all the code that runs on the software you develop, what's to guarantee they know all the software that runs on all the versions of all the code that they develop? And if you're not running the absolute latest, greatest, maybe not.
Because they're also embedding third party, right? So they're not building everything from scratch either.
Correct. Everybody leans on those that came before, right? And we beg, borrow, and steal to make our stuff work. So does everybody else, right? So, so there's a huge problem there. There's also a problem in that when these things are found and when a fix is created, it's never perfect, right? So 2.16 is the current version as of this morning. 2.15 is still being used, and 2.15 has a huge hole that was discovered, revealed, bubbled to the top of my notifications, whatever, at 2:15 this morning. So, so God forbid you updated and the code that your vendor released was running 2.15 because you got another flaw that you got to go deal with now. Right. And this is just the latest in a series of attacks that's going to continue to happen for the foreseeable future.
And what a worse time, right? I assume your freeze started either 2 days ago or December 1. So now you're incorporating. No, we don't have a freeze like that. We have, the reality is we're pushing to get everything that we can completed before the first of the year so that we can close whatever invoices we have for the 2021 budget. I see.
Right. That's our biggest challenge right now, but it's also balancing the need for people to take vacation, right? Plant shutdowns, holidays, those sort of things.
Right.
And no matter what you do, this is a time of reduced staffing.
Right. Certainly.
Right. So yeah, without a doubt, this is a horrible time for this sort of thing to happen. And this isn't just an IT issue, right? Things like this aren't just an IT issue. I've got compliance involved. I've got legal involved, right? These kind of things start to happen, and you start a chain of notifications that kind of takes the DEFCON level from 5 to 1, right? We are now 2 minutes from midnight on the DEFCON clock, right? What's interesting, I heard a great talk at DEFCON or at Black Hat that kind of talks about why these issues are so prevalent. And one of the things they talked about was we're no longer the target, right? We're not target number one right now.
We being company or we being people?
We being company.
Okay.
Right. The number one target right now is actually the security researchers. And the reason the security researchers are target number one is because of how we likely pay bug bounties. Right. So we pay a bigger bug bounty the more thorough the research is, but we only pay it one time.
Right.
Right. So the larger the hole is that's found, the larger the bug bounty, but it's not iterative. Right. And so what that does is that encourages security researchers to hold on to whatever research they have, whatever flaws they find, until they've taken it to the nth degree. right? Until they've thoroughly explored it, until it is all the way totally complete so they can turn it in for the most money. Makes total sense.
They're looking for the biggest, most pervasive hole to maximize their personal revenue.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which they absolutely should, right? This isn't a complaint about them at all.
Yeah.
However, that does mean that if they get targeted and that research is grabbed at any point, it can start being valued by attackers immediately.
Right.
And so the research is showing that's what's happening. Right. The best target, the most lucrative targets are the really good security researchers. And then we're totally exposed, right? Because security researchers are focused on 0 days. 0 days are things no one knows about, right? They're actually negative days because they haven't been released, so they're not even a 0 day. Right. So then all of a sudden this stuff's in the wild. Now no one's going to get paid on it, right? You've undone the value of your bug bounty. And honestly, the way to solve it is pay iterative bug bounties. Change the way you pay your bug bounties.
If that's the risk, if that's the target, does that not presume then that the risk, the impact risk of these things occurring is lower? So if they're not, duty bound to find and abuse the data to which they find in our organizations, at least that's not where they're focusing their time, then the resolution isn't as I wouldn't say necessary, but not as timely as we need it to be. Not true?
Oh, no, because what effectively is happening is they're going after the people inventing the master key.
Right. And they want a bunch of those master keys.
Right. So instead of going to the front door and going, how do I pick this lock? They're just going, screw that. I'm going to go to the guys making the master key and just go steal the master key, and then I can open all the locks.
Okay. So their perspective is, I'm still going to come back to you. I'm just not worried about it at the moment. Keep collecting valuable info. Right.
Yeah. Right. Your target, and again, it means I'm not picking each individual lock.
Right.
It's kind of what made the SolarWinds thing so interesting. So what makes supply chain so interesting, right? Because attacks are an immense amount of work, and so you have to be very cautious in picking your target, right? Otherwise, you're not really going to get a payout that justifies the expense. And what SolarWinds changed, what supply chains attacks in general change, is now instead of going, okay, I'm going to go do some recon against 10 targets, I'm going to figure out, who's got some exposure, what I can see about them, develop a profile, right? Kind of go through all those standard investigative techniques. Instead, they go, okay, cool. There's now this huge there's this huge supply chain attack. How many customers have this? Oh, everybody? 300,000? Sweet. So now instead of having to go, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's pick 1 or 2. Now I have 300,000 potential attacks. Right. I can narrow it down to who I want to attack right now.
Right. So the goal is to get the keylogger in OEM keyboards so that
so
that everybody has it, right? And nobody's detected it, and nobody cares, nobody thinks it would even be there, and they're winning.
Yeah, I mean, you remember the Sony rootkit?
Yeah.
Right? Sony put a rootkit on their audio CDs years and years and years ago that immediately got out in the wild and turned into kind of the base code for every single rootkit.
Right.
Right. It was an awful, terrible, horrible idea perpetrated by a company that had their best interest in mind, and they weren't malicious in kind of their thought process. I would argue that it was the wrong thought process and the wrong way to handle the issue, but that had an unintended consequence that had repercussions through the technology world forever. Right. And that's not going to change, and that's not going to be different. And so what I posit, what we need to do really is start looking at, we need to kind of go back to our roots and go, security is really about damage reduction and damage prevention, right? But I don't think we focus enough on blast radius. Right. So if something does get compromised, what is the potential blast radius? And have we done everything from a design standpoint, starting way at the beginning,
right,
to mitigate the blast radius?
Is this a zero trust architecture? Is that what you're talking about here?
Sure. But I think zero trust gets thrown around a lot. Like there's a ton, I get hit up 3 times a week from companies saying that they have the perfect zero trust architecture. They have the perfect zero trust solution, but their solution is this wide.
Right. It's
That's not
just
zero
for
trust.
certain types of communications. Yeah.
Correct. It's just for this one thing.
Yeah.
Zero trust is network wide.
Right.
You can't have these massive. You can't say I've got a zero trust platform and it's this wide.
Right. Just for this one domain. Everything else is completely open.
Right. Just for my Apache 4 servers running intranets that are only powered up for an audience between like north of Canada and south of Peru.
Right. Then
like,
it's perfect.
Yeah, and I'm perfect there. Like the rest of it's Swiss cheese, but I'm perfect there. Right. And actually the Swiss cheese analogy is one I really like. But if we start from kind of network architecture and really look at how are we doing our network segmentation, did we ever get anywhere with microsegmentation?
Right.
Like how deep did we get into this? That's the fundamental tool to reducing blast radius.
Right.
Am I properly using firewalls at the right points? Am I making sure that systems can only talk to the systems that they're allowed to talk to, that they should talk to in the way they should talk to? And I'm not saying you should have that perfected, because that really is kind of, that's a big end game step for zero trust. But how far are you? Do you have any network?
But that's much harder than heart surgery. This is potentially replacing the circulatory system.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Heart surgery is just changing the core. Now you might have to string along new veins to make this happen.
Yep, right. Without a doubt.
Right, or have multiple hearts just to make sure that I can still beat if I had to.
Yeah, but we should be running multiple hearts anyhow, right? That's what disaster recovery is all about.
Right.
But the reality is, disaster recovery is a really good example. Disaster recovery is built to deal with system failure.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what it's built for, right? It's a hardware resiliency package.
Right.
It's a light software resiliency package that's not really software resiliency. Something went wrong with the hardware or the data itself. And that's our disaster recovery. Right. But that is becoming so much less likely than a security attack.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Exactly. The risk is lower than security attacks now. Yeah.
Right. So then shouldn't our disaster recovery change from hardware mitigation to security management? Shouldn't the focus on disaster recovery become reduction of blast radius rather than mitigation of hardware failure?
Yep. I buy that completely. In fact, your CMDB should be less about the assets and more about the connectivity between those assets.
No,
right? And how they're protected.
Agree.
Yeah.
Wholeheartedly agree. So then what we need as just kind of basic steps is, and let's use your circulatory example because I really like it. Right. So what if we put firewalls at the wrists and the ankles? Just start there.
Right.
And say at the wrists and the ankles, we've got the most endpoints, right? We do all of our touching at the wrists and the ankles, outside of the wrists and the ankles. Put a firewall at each of the wrists, put a firewall at each of the ankles. Turn it to none. And then default deny and turn on the things you need for sure.
Right.
Just to the wrist and just to the ankles. Like my ISV software that doesn't communicate to my systems in the cloud should not be able to get to the cloud.
Right.
Do I need to have that open for any reason? Does that system need to be able to get out? No, probably not.
Yeah.
Right. So
is that distinctly different than the usual implementation of DMZs? How?
Sure, because DMZs are things that I'm exposing to external internet.
Right.
But there's still a ton of systems that can open a shell to a random website on the internet. Right. That's DMZ is all about incoming traffic. Well, now we're talking about outgoing traffic. Outgoing traffic is almost as dangerous, right? Once I establish that tunnel, now I've got two-way communication.
Right. Exactly.
Right? So I need to figure out how do I mitigate those tunnels? If those things are backdoors through, someone gets into my endpoint.
Yeah.
Right. Then uses my endpoint to pivot to a system in my data center, and then from there spreads to everywhere.
Right.
And once they're in the system in the data center, I don't care about that endpoint anymore, right? Because burn it, I don't care. Now I can establish a tunnel directly to my data center. Now you're host, right? Now I'm in the heart.
Right.
You're no longer cutting off a finger to save the body, because that's where the cancer's at. The cancer's in the core.
Right.
Cancer's in the brainstem, whatever analogy you want to use.
So that wrist firewall is a two-way border security, right? I'm not letting things in. I'm not letting things out. You're showing me your passport. I'm identifying you as a person first. Even if you're just leaving the country, I need to know that to be true.
Correct. Yeah. Basically, the way we design networks today is very much like the EU.
Right.
Right. The EU, once
first
the EU
country in. Yeah.
Correct. First country in, and then you're good. You're good. Right. I was in the Netherlands during COVID, driving into Germany, because it's just right there, and you just drive into Germany, and then you turn around and drive back in the Netherlands, and no one bats an eye. No one looks at you funny. Right. It's like crossing from Colorado to Arizona. There's nothing. Right. It's just like driving inside the US. And what I would say is it needs to be more like driving into California. Right. California has checkpoints that are purely agricultural. Right. Because they have certain requirements against certain agricultural influences, because they produce so much ag for the US. Right. That was determined to be critical years ago. So you get stopped at the border. Theoretically, they do a lot of wave throughs, but they do random checks at the border, and you get asked questions, and then you proceed on, right? So what I'm suggesting is a system more like that, right? Make it like customs. It doesn't have to be super onerous. It doesn't have to be this huge barrier, right? And it's totally cool for those wrist things to also be your connectivity, to have connectivity, broadband connectivity, and go, cool, you're going out, okie dokie.
Sure.
Right. This is what we've authorized you to go out. Don't go through the data center. Why do you need to go through the data center for that? Right. Let's offload that traffic at that point. Right. It does absolutely increase the complexity of our network. Unequivocally. No two ways about it.
Where did you eat in Germany? Did you go for the bratwurst? Is that why you traveled?
Nowhere, because you couldn't go into anything.
I see.
Right. So what I was trying to do, so in the EU, if you want to do anything, you have to have a QR code.
Yep.
And in the Netherlands, you have to have a government ID to get a thing in the Netherlands, and you can't do it as an American. So somebody said, go to Germany, you can get it in Germany. Went to Germany, went to a pharmacy. Yeah. And they said, no, we can only do it for EU. Like if you got your vaccine in the EU, try this other place. So we decided we'd try another pharmacy. We walked into that pharmacy, and they said, no, you can't come in because your masks aren't N95 masks or whatever.
Wow.
So then we turned around and left. And then we're like, okay, well, it's small. It's just a small town because that was the closest thing. And we're like, we don't have time to go to the bigger city and try to track this down. So then we left.
I see.
Yeah. But what we were trying to do was get the QR code, so we had a little bit less restriction on what we could do in the Netherlands.
Right.
It didn't work. So we were just fully restricted.
So you were restricted.
The hotel 4 times.
Yummy.
Thankfully, the hotel actually had a good room service menu.
Okay, good. That's helpful.
Right.
And you were there. You were there for a while.
But yeah 2 weeks.
Yeah. Thanks.
I saw a fantastic World War II museum, probably the best I've ever seen. The movie A Bridge Too Far is about Operation Market Garden, which was an Allied mission to capture a series of bridges that failed miserably. It was during the kind of end of the war. They didn't have good intelligence on the Nazis. They ended up landing, and only to find the Nazis were doing training in the area. So they had a huge force, and they kind of got their butts kicked. So it was really interesting. We're in the building that was the headquarters of both the Allies and Nazis at various times during the war. And they converted that to a museum, and all the above ground floors were kind of traditional museum, right? But they had, being American, we didn't have anybody land here, right? The only attack we had was from the air. There were no ground troops at Pearl Harbor. So to see pictures of, hey, if you go out and go to the left about 400 feet, this is a picture that was taken there, is extremely interesting, right? Wow. And then you go to the basement, and it was a full interactive walkthrough that was the night of the main battle at the Rhine, at the bridge. And so they had built this whole thing up. It was dark. They had lights flashing. They had, dead cars and paintings on, stuff on the wall. And it was this big walkthrough that really, it felt immersive, right? It really Like it was absolutely fantastic. And then they ended it with a kind of, the hallway that you exit had lines on the wall that showed the KIA and the prisoners, the POWs captured during the battle, and it was it's crazy. It was really cool. Really talked about a lot about Polish as well, right? Because the Poles got a bad rap. They were an early Nazi capture, and in the area they were thought to kind of be Nazi. And in this battle particularly, there were some Poles involved that were trying to help free this area of the Netherlands. And for decades and decades and decades, they got no recognition because their uniforms were British SAS uniforms with a different beret, effectively. So people that saw them just thought they were SAS.
Right.
It was decades before they found that no, that was a Polish resistance unit that came in to try to help, and it was very cool.
Awesome.
Totally distracts from where we were going, but
it was a good ending, though. It was a good wrap up for Carlos.
we went from talking from LogJ, from then prisoners of war. Well, probably we're gonna connect with all of it because we may end up being prisoners of what happened of our information leaving. But I think that you touched some interesting points. Looking at not only what you know that you have, but probably those other ISVs that you probably integrate or that you bring into, and how they actually roam in your environment. That was really interesting. And I was thinking about how the cloud actually blocks certain things now by default and other ones don't, to help with some of it. But you just touch into the, oh, we have zero trust. But like you said, it's this small. It's beyond just what you're aware of. Is how do you truly interact and to understand your total environment. My friends, take the time to understand where you are, what you have, what you're doing, because as leaders, our role is to get everything that we can so it could be secure and that we can lead our teams. My friends, we'll see you on our next episode.